And now going live. You can start.
Whenever I can start, yeah?
No, so hello everybody and welcome. I'm Køge, the head of the Department of International Relations at Tbilisi Conservatory, and also in collaboration with Malmö Academy of Music, I'd like to open the third session of the international panel discussion series, Freedom in Music Education. Before we begin our meeting, as stated, I'd like to state also that we're horrified by the Russia's attack and the war in Ukraine. The State Conservatory strongly supports Ukrainian friends and colleagues there, and also we are ready to welcome the Ukrainian students at the State Conservatory. We understand that the Ukraine needs everybody's support now, strong support from the Western allies, and as the battle is for general peace in the world and in Europe, and freedom in the democratic world. After this note, I'd like to remind you that we have the 6 meetings within this project, and it will be discussed the current challenges of the higher music education. International experts, professional musicians, and representatives of high educational institutions will be the speakers of the events from more than 10 countries of the world. Discussions are live streamed on the State Conservatory Facebook page every Monday at 4 CET from February 28th to April the 4th. The main topic of the third meeting is East-West divide, building bridges or deepening the gap. And our speakers today are Eდგars Raginskis, is a composer, musicologist, culture journalist from Latvia. Thomas Winther, he's a former rector at the Royal Academy of Music in Orhus, Denmark. Hans Hellsten, he's a vice rector at Malmö Academy of Music at Lund University in Sweden. And we will have also David Alladashvili. He's a pianist, TV presenter, PhD student at Tbilisi State Conservatory from Georgia. I'm very proud to have you all here. For our third session, we asked our participants to discuss following issues. Fukuyama's theory was nothing but utopia. What is ahead? The process of transition and democratization at high music educational institutions. What are the government's policies in, and what advantages or disadvantages it has when it comes to the performance? And we're happy to have Eდგars Raginskis as our first speaker. He's a Latvian composer, musicologist, culture journalist, and a PhD candidate at the Hong Kong Baptist University Department of Music. He is researching musical censorship in the Composers Union, the former Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic. He specializes in moderating live broadcasts from the concert halls and other venues, contemporary music productions for the media, pre-recorded and live interviews. His compositional interests predominantly gravitate towards the music for the stage. And as of September 2021, Eდგars is a member of the executive board of the Latvian Composers Union. So dear Eდგars, the floor is yours, and we'll be listening to you.
Thank you kindly. Let me first share the screen, if I may, and please indicate if you see my screen.
Yes,
Super, super. Then I will start. So, in the scope of today's discussion, the topic I'm going to present is very interesting for me, both as a composer and as a censorship scholar, because it signals and it in the same time embodies the divide, bridging the gap between West and East, then again widening it, and now in contemporary Latvia trying to narrow and maybe eliminate the gap altogether once again. So, as you probably all know, Latvia is one of the Baltic states, and it was independent from 1918 to 1945, or let's say even less, 1939. And then it was occupied by Soviet Union, and we regained our stately independence in 1991 once again. So the totalitarian and the democratic system and the specifics of these systems is very evident in the current cultural climate of Latvia and also in its higher music education. So let's first start with one slight question, which I was faced when I started my music education in 1990 or 1991. Although it was already the independent Republic of Latvia, we still had the residual effects of the former Soviet Union, and how couldn't we? Because all the teaching staff at the music schools, conservatories, and other educational institutions was itself taught in the Soviet system and within the Soviet doctrine. So it had strict standards to which to adhere, and also the youngsters who needed to be brought up in the cultural educational system of Latvia also needed to be brought up along those lines, because there were none other lines to be spoken about at that time. So in the creative process, it is extra important to consider this parameter of may or can, of being able to do something within the creative scope of one's expertise, or maybe just emerging expertise of some musical instrument or composition or music theory or whatever. And during my early years at the music school, me together with other students and basically with other kids, we were constantly at odds with this principle of, on one hand, our teachers told us that we can do whatever we want and to express ourselves in the best manner we see fit. But on the other hand, I still encountered situations in my piano training, because I graduated as a professional pianist, where I was suddenly approached by my teacher, who said that you can play it either this way, which is right, or you can play it the other way, which is wrong, and the second way was no option. Yeah, so a non-starter. So keep that in mind. Now, certain theoretical aspects and theoretical things which I would like you to dwell on a little bit. This is from one of my favorite theoreticians, which I'm basing my doctoral research on. It's P.G. Ingram, and it concerns specifically censorship theory from the philosophical standpoint. That means not taking any sides and considering both the liberal and totalitarian approach, and well, just thinking about that restrictions during the process of education are inevitable, and basically these restrictions are put there by the system, by the current political system, specifically to cater to the needs of the children, considering their maybe, let's say, volatile and still forming mind. Yeah, but of course the needs I put in quotation marks, because as the person grows older, one understands more and more about their own individual needs and less about their adherence to the system as the predominant aspect of their personality. So this is the first aspect. The second aspect is that this complete freedom in the educational process, neither in totalitarian nor in liberal society, is really an option, because you can see that otherwise children could be easily exposed to things they really should not be exposed to, and this belligerent behavior from the others could spill over to youngsters. I am still focusing on the young people because although we are discussing higher education, we still need to understand where it all stems from, especially from which paradigm are we viewing the freedom in education and music education, and also limits of this freedom. So yeah, there is a certain difference between inculcation of opinions and indoctrination. And one idea is to provide students with various standpoints and maybe steer them to the direction of the right behavior or socially responsible behavior for the current system. And the other, especially relatable to those who have been brought up in the totalitarian state, is of course this indoctrination. And the Soviet paradigm or Bolshevik paradigm specifically emphasized that creation of adhering and self-censoring individual is paramount for ideological purposes, so that the young professional of whichever field would just follow the party lines and not even engage in anything remotely, potentially defiant of the political system. Now a little bit about the Music Academy of Latvia. It is 2 years younger than Tbilisi Music Conservatory. It was founded in 1919, and it was a huge success during the first period of independent Latvia, as Latvian musicians who were studying there, they were able to go to Western Europe and to enrich themselves with musical experiences from the Western world. Their professors had studied at the conservatories both in the West and the East, the magnificent Moscow and St. Petersburg, also Kyiv conservatories, and the Western Europe also. So it was a huge shock when the Second World War transformed the educational institutions and, integrated, let's put it mildly, the conservatory into the Soviet educational system. And although we regained our independence and Music Academy also became, an independent institution in 1991, we are still struggling with the residual effects of this Soviet period. Not everything was, let's say, bad, or if we like the polarization of bad and good and evil during the Soviet time, but some things were different, to say the least. So let's start with those differences in higher music education in totalitarian society. Obviously, if I will try to be very detailed about all those discrepancies, I would probably extend my time to ununderstandable lengths, so I'll be brief. But let's say that the first line you can see about this limited access to music education, or unrestricted access based on ideological parameters, was there for many people who had, stained biographies. And by stained I mean people who were from bourgeoisie families, who had some Christian ministers in their families, or whatever the state found to be belligerent or, unadhering to the political system. And the second element, or the second row of this table, is basically the key aspect: the dedicated ideological education, the Marxist, the communist, the Bolshevik education, which was there in whichever academy you think of. It was there in Georgia, it was there in Latvia and other Soviet countries. And this was the poison, let's say, that poisoned all the students who went into the higher music education, and it continues to some degree, maybe poison some of the older generation representatives still until nowadays, although to much lesser degree, of course. The totalitarian regime or restrictive regimes favor certain musical styles and somehow neglect others. Let's say modernist movement of the 20th century was unavailable for many students of higher music education institutions in Latvia, and that is gone, luckily. And also, when people wanted to play, for example, music of sacred nature or some sacred church genres, well, it's probably hard to say if anyone found oneself to be willing to do that at certain moments, especially during the Stalinist era. But regardless, then there was a huge ideological pressure on that as well. And living behind the Iron Curtain, Latvian musicians during the Soviet times could not participate in many musical events which could lead to their musical and cultural enrichment and to facilitate the cultural bond between the East and the West. I think I do not need to explain any further with that. And speaking about this pressure and psychological pressure, it was not only regarding the repertoire, but also the musical performances, the dominant strains or dominant traditions within the musical performance, those of the Soviet tradition and those of the decadent Western influences, which were not to be followed. Although when certain bright performers came to East, let's say Van Cliburn comes to mind first, people still tried to imitate him regardless. But yeah, the psychological pressure was there. Again, the second row of this table is very important and something we are still struggling with up until nowadays, because if a new political system comes into power, it tries to eliminate all the residual effects or all the, how to say, memories of the previous political system. Those composers who were alive and working in the first independent Latvia, they found themselves personas non grata during the Soviet times, and even if they could continue their musical work, it was very, very different from before the Soviet authorities came into power. And many students who started their education during the Soviet times, they did not know any about many cultural accomplishments of the younger days, and that in turn somehow facilitated the generational gap between the people of today and people of yesterday. And although we are trying to, again, give voices to those who were silenced back then and try to unearth the artifacts of our musical heritage, it is still sometimes a bit sporadic, or maybe it remains quite a challenge for certain people. And the last one is, of course, which relates to my research, my PhD research, is the coercion and censorship, for example, of composition students. Let's look at those two guys. The person on the left, you probably all more or less are familiar with. It's Pēteris Vasks, the most famous Latvian composer of the contemporary age, and he was also my teacher during my student years at the Latvian Emīls Dārziņš Music High School. And this person is a son of a Baptist priest. That meant that when he came to Latvian State Conservatory in 1960s, in the late 60s, he was turned down and basically hushed away from the music academy. So because you are the son of a minister, you cannot study here because your biography is not good. What did he do? He went to Lithuania because the party apparatus in Latvia and Lithuania was not in such a good contact. And also Lithuanians were far more patriotic and nationalist in their worldview. They allowed Pēteris Vasks to study at the Lithuanian Conservatory. Regardless, he was able to later study as double bass player in Latvia as well, so that was an accomplishment for him. And the person on the right is Aldonis Kalniņš, who is he's still alive and active. I mean, alive and active, I'm saying with a certain, it's not incidental because he's 96 or 97 already. And I interviewed him as a part of my PhD research, and he told that during his student years, due to his bourgeois, or let's say peasant upbringing, and all his relatives were sent to prison and to gulag, he had to adhere to party standards and try to be, let's say, extra communist in his worldview and create silly compositions like Collective Farm Workers March or Waltz of Collective Farm Director. Like, it blows your mind away, but regardless, he had to jump through those hoops. And it is only one example, and Pēteris Vasks is also another example, but there were many, many of those during the Soviet times. Luckily, not anymore. Now, what can be done and what has been done? Of course, the institutions have been reorganized, and Latvian Music Conservatory is not anymore as it was, no ideological education, etc. Also, the inner infrastructure and who is dependent on whom has been how to say, altered, but still the psychological aspect of the older generation, or those who studied and were teachers in the Soviet times, has to be taken into consideration, because those people, although we came to the democratic system of contemporarity in 1991, they still struggle with trying to combine what they were taught during the Soviet times and what they see nowadays in the independent democratic system. And of course, these are the generational differences. Although I can say that the youngsters who are nowadays studying at the conservatory, they're of completely different breed, and they probably do not even bother themselves with the question I asked in the beginning of this talk. So my timer is up, and I think that my speech is also up, and I hope you got some ideas about my contemplations and maybe got some food for thought yourselves as well. So thank you kindly for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. And of course, as a culture journalist, you had a perfect timing, right? And I'm astonished that how many similarities. Of course, I'm not surprised the Georgian and the Latvian music academies and conservatory have, and I'm very happy that we have here like pre-Berlin Wall division with a like equal representation of the speakers, and especially like self-censoring. Like we still have like today a lot of issues concerning that as well, at even in the Tbilisi State Conservatory. And I just want to say to our viewers on Facebook that you can ask the questions in the comments, and then in the end of the session we will be able to answer the questions you might have, and also like some small disclaimer here that our speakers are stating their own individual views, and that might not represent the view of the Tbilisi State Conservatory. And our next speaker, thank you, Edgars, again very much. And next speaker is Thomas Winter. Is it is through management of major institutions, complicated team building processes within them, and heading up large music productions, Thomas Winter has developed his experience as a leader of cultural institutions and as an internationally accomplished producer of music. In 2008, Thomas Winter was appointed rector of the Royal Academy of Music in Aarhus, Denmark, and the largest conservatory in Denmark measured by numbers of students. In 2019, Thomas was elected president of the Association of Danish Music and Culture Schools. As president, he represents 98 schools within the nationwide, and also the school's political and strategic interests in relation to the Ministry of Culture and the municipalities. So, Thomas, thank you for being with us, and we'll be listening to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I used to work at the Danish Broadcasting Corporation, and we always said that it was a really good broadcast if the timing was right. So our previous speaker actually made a very, very good speech. Thank you very much. As Ivry said, I'm Thomas Winter. I have been working as a rector for the Royal Academy of Music in Aarhus and Aalborg, and before that I was also head of studies and vice rector at the Royal Danish Academy of Music in Copenhagen. So although it's been a few years since I have worked in higher music education, it is still relatively present for me. The given topic for today is, of course, the East-West divide, building bridges or deepening the gap, a topic that has become so much more relevant today than it was, I'm sure, when the title was first conceived. I am going to talk about this subject, but maybe in a slightly twisted way, and looking at some of the issues here in a helicopter perspective. But here it goes. Our liberal democracies are under pressure, and now after the Russian invasion in the Ukraine, maybe even under threat. I work on this short talk in the days Russia launches its full-scale invasion of the Ukraine. I am, like most other people, outraged by the act of violence and the attack on democracy that the Russian government has launched on Ukraine. I'm saddened by the horrific terror inflicted on the Ukrainian people, and I am deeply worried about nationalistic populism in general. There are also Russian troops in Georgia. Likewise, I would like to express my solidarity with the people of Georgia who's also experiencing the consequences of the Putin regime's expansionistic ambitions. So, are we building bridges or are we deepening the gap? It is my sincere hope and my belief that the present Russian regime and what it represents will not prevail. Peoples chained against their will always eventually rise in the cry for the right to self-determination, and states founded on nationalism, populism, and autocracy will always eventually collapse. I strongly believe that democracy and freedom will always prevail. Or will it? We're talking about Fukuyama earlier on, and this is maybe where some of his thoughts, or maybe some of the debate after his thoughts, come to life. Is liberal democracy actually prevailing? Will liberal democracy be able to solve the grave challenges our global society faces? Climate change, destruction of biodiversity, abuse of the planet's resources, terror, etc. Will some form of autocracy actually prove to be more efficient in solving these problems when you don't have to take the will of the people into consideration? Liberal democracies are generally tied to capitalism. Can capitalism actually solve the problems we have with poverty and growing inequality? And what about the technological development? Can we always be sure that the market makes the best technological solutions? Or is it more likely that the strive for short-term profits will be the driver for future technological development? These and many more questions, are the ones we should ask ourselves. Are we naive, full of ourselves, and Western-centric in supposing we have found the solutions to it all? Is our view of the world too narrow? Do we have blind spots? And if so, where are they? No, of course, we have not found the perfect system. It would be stupid to assume that and make that claim. But liberal democracy, with all its many flaws and shortcomings, have one property superior to any other form of social and political system. It has proven over the last couple of centuries to be better at securing the freedom of each individual by advocating the free distribution of thought and knowledge, including artistic expression. I will claim that liberal democracy does this better than any other form of government. This enables us to formulate the ideas of self-determination and the individual pursuit of happiness. It gives us the basis for pluralism and diversity, and as I said, the basis for artistic expression. Quoting Winston Churchill, who, as you will know, was a conservative prime minister in Great Britain during World War II and deeply rooted in the British aristocracy. Churchill said, "No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms that have been tried from time to time." So on the basis of this very superficial argumentation, I will jump to the conclusion that having a political system based on liberal democracy is a prerequisite for free artistic expression, and also that free artistic expression is a prerequisite for liberal democracies. It's a circular argument where one phenomenon is dependent on the other, and if the chain is broken, you have neither free expression nor liberal democracies. In the form of liberal democracy that we call the welfare state, maybe especially in the Nordic social democratic version, the consensus is that everybody should be contributing to sustaining society to the best of your ability through your daily work, paying taxes, by participating in social life through civic institutions, etc. There's respect for the law of the land. People have trust in the public institutions and government. It can be argued that a social contract has been drawn up between the people and the state, because a society based on social, political, and economic homogeneity and equality has successfully been established. But even in the Nordic countries, this balance is tipping, and populism, taste for autocratic government, and nationalism is showing its ugly face. This tendency we see all over the Western world, where liberal democracies are under threat. Look at the US, look at Poland and Hungary, look at the present presidential campaign in France, and look at the political climate in Scandinavia, in Denmark maybe particularly. Especially right-wing national conservative populism is gaining terrain all over the globe, but even center-left and center-right governments use elements of populism in their communication and governing methods. Pluralism and complexity is definitely not in vogue at this time, at this point in time. It's beyond the scope of this short talk to try to explain the reasons for this development, but it is clear to see that groups in society feel left out. They feel threatened by globalism, they lose their income, they cannot relate or connect to society as it develops and changes. People in rural areas feel underprivileged compared to people living in urban centers, and the less educated feel that the elite looks down on them and robs them of privileges and possibilities by embracing economic globalism. There are both social, economic, cultural, educational reasons for this exodus from the political parties, the old political parties, so to speak, and the democratic bodies that were founded after World War II and the social system that they were based on. The liberal democracies have at one point in time especially failed tremendously. The European governments of the 1920s and the 1930s were, in hindsight, disastrously passive in standing up against totalitarian regimes and populism, and they were disastrously incapable of finding solution for all those that were attracted to fascism, communism, and other autocratic forms of government. Let us not repeat that mistake. As you mentioned, I work as a director of a music school for children in a suburb of Copenhagen. The music school, like other public music schools in Denmark, is an institution mainly funded by the municipality, and as such, very close, is collaborating very closely with the local government, other local arts institutions, the local community in general. The music school is in many ways looked on as other local institutions funded by the municipality, such as public schools, health services, daycare, and institutions for the elderly. The music schools have over the last decade or so changed from being institutions that primarily just taught children to play the violin or piano or electric guitar to now being an integrated part of our welfare system. This is a change of paradigm that cannot be overestimated. The public music schools have, as local arts institutions, changed their focuses from music for music's sake to music being instrumental, sorry, no pun intended, for creating communities, artistic experiences, and better quality of life for the people. One of my catchphrases these days is that we are also music schools for the children who don't play. In order to succeed in this task, we need to employ teachers with more, and in many cases, different competences than only musical. We need teachers that understand pedagogy beyond music pedagogy, who understands and are able to teach classrooms, who can not only play and teach music at a very high level, but can also use music as a tool for learning and social processes. We need teachers who understand and embrace the phenomenon, the idea of the artistic citizenship. Educating musicians who has a deep understanding of this change in paradigm requires a change not only in the mindset of each individual teacher, but also in the mindset of the students, and maybe most importantly, in the mindset of our institutions, our higher music teaching institutions. This is not about devaluating musical training and saying that we all need to be kindergarten teachers. It is rather understanding that art and music has a set of properties that can enable the artist and musician to serve the public in more ways than giving them artistic or aesthetic experiences. We must obtain a willingness to take on a social responsibility and a responsibility to use our talents in creating better quality of life for people, not only for the audiences in the concert halls. Extending my catchphrase from before, we have to be musicians for the people who don't listen to music. Artistic citizenship isn't about not making art. There is absolutely no doubt that music is of an enormous artistic value in its own right and brings both joy and insight to a lot of people. And in order to do this, we have to have the best and uppermost musical education. Artistic citizenship is about taking on additional obligations and acquiring more competences. It's about adding on, not throwing away. Higher music education institutions have an enormous responsibility in facilitating this change and in helping transform the mindsets of students and teachers. We need new ways to look at pedagogy, new ways to understand our audiences, new ways to look at the concept of the work. For example, in some pedagogical or social processes, the work can be the process in itself and not necessarily the end result. Now you maybe sit and wonder, what on earth is he rambling on about? What has this to do with all he said in the beginning about populism and the liberal democracy? What it has to do with the East-West divide? Well, maybe not so much actually. But it rather has to do with the divide between liberal democracies and populist autocracies, which of course today is represented in all its gruesomeness by the Russian government. And to be frank, I also think it has to do about being progressive and having the courage to look into the future or to be conservative. I think it is enormously important that we as musicians and artists, well, as citizens in our societies, understand that we cannot leave anybody behind. We have to be musicians and make music in its broadest sense for everyone. And that includes making music for the underprivileged, for the uneducated, for people who wouldn't dream of going to a concert listening to a Mahler symphony or a jazz concert. It includes making music for children, working in kindergartens and elementary schools, in retirement homes and hospitals, and working in projects of inclusion and integration. It has to do with deep understanding of co-creation, not about taking art to the masses, which everybody since the 1970s has been talking about, but generally working with people where they are, creating music with them on equal terms and accepting that the process can be the work. Music making has to come back to being a social phenomenon, not always an art form. This is all important if we want to contribute to maintaining the liberal democracy and advocating social and avoiding social polarization. In this context, it becomes very clear why higher arts education institutions and the management, teachers and students in them must take artistic citizenship very serious and promote the idea that through being part of society, we can promote change, communicate complex topics, create communities, and maintain relevance with the general public. By taking our artistic citizenship seriously, we can contribute to fighting polarization and populism and help sustaining and developing democracy. Democracy, the worst political system, except for all the other ones. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting and important conversation. And I think really made us think that, especially when we live now in the era of the declining superpower, and we have the adversaries and the alternative that is not the liberal democracies, and that is the Russia and China, especially the artistic citizenship and social responsibility comes forward in the higher arts education and higher music education. So thank you for this input. And now we move on to Hans Helsten. He's been the professor of organ at Malmö Academy of Music since 1992. He is involved in extensive concert activities and has performed in most European countries, as well as in the United States and Canada. In addition to teaching and organ playing, Hans is also involved in helping congregations that need to acquire new instruments and participate in concert and festival production. And today he holds the vice directorship position at Malmö Academy of Music at Lund University. So Hans, thank you for being with us, and we'll be listening to you.
Thank you very much. I would like to make some short reflections on some key concepts attached to music education today, and my background to this reflection will be the fact that I work with music pedagogic on a conservatory level. I think that why I make this reservation will be clear to you when I come to my third key concept. The first one is, well, no surprise, democracy. What is democracy? There are many definitions, but I think one that would provide a very good starting point for this reflection is that everybody has a voice. It's a musical definition of democracy, but a political one as well. Everybody has a voice. This voice can be used for voting, but it can be used for speaking, for discussing. I think this is quite important. This does not mean, of course, that democracy is anarchy. I mean, everybody's not speaking at the same time. There are rules surrounding this fact that everybody has a voice. There are rules, and there are institutions also. I mean, institutions in which these discussions between these different voices can take place. All this is very important. Of course, there is a concept behind all this, and that's equality. If everybody has a voice, then everybody's equal. We don't have somebody who has two voices and another person having five and a third one just having one. Everybody has one voice. So democracy is not anarchy. There are rules for the using of the voice. There are institutions for the using of the voices taking place somewhere. And equality is a concept attached very much to this. I think this has something to do with music education. If everybody has a voice, this applies both to professors and to students. And in principle, these voices are equal, in principle. But we know as musical educators that that is not the case. Why? We could discuss that through the grid of another key concept here, and that's power. In democracy, power is still existing. Somebody has the power. The power is exercised, and it's visible and present. So, for example, and how does this have to do with the fact that everybody has a voice? Well, let's see. Let's look at the relation between a music professor and a music student. Of course, the music professor has more power in the respect that he or she has more experience, will probably be older, will probably earn more money. Well, many things. It's an asymmetrical relation. But that is not the complete story of it. It's asymmetrical, yes. But this relation has something that is a very important feature of democracy also. Of course, and that is how to use your voice and in what situations. And in democracy, I would say the concept here to be used is the concept of veto. This is very important. If we look at democracy, we have a government in power. There's not very much to be done about that. You can have discussion in the public sphere, etc., but the government is still there. But it can be vetoed away at certain occasions. So we all know that when we vote for different governments, political parties, it's a kind of commercial thing. It has commercial sides to it. I mean, we vote for people who sell us the best ideas. But this is not really the most important thing. The most important thing is that we can make them go away. We can use our voices, we can use them in the form of a veto. This is very important for democracy. And this applies to music education as well. Of course, the music professor will know more and will have a greater psychological force also in convincing the student, but the student always has a veto, always. And this, I think this is very important to know and reflect upon. So I've talked about democracy and the idea that everybody has a voice. I've talked about power, which we still have in democracy, but which is balanced by the mechanism of the veto. So democracy, power, and voice and veto. Now, my third concept. In music institutions on a high level, most of the teaching, instrumental or vocal teaching, I'm not talking about, well, a lot of the theoretical teaching as well, is taking place in very small groups. And these groups are often so small that they are comprised only two persons, the music professor and the music student. There are, of course, variations, but this is kind of the basic setup. It's the one-to-one teaching situation. This is a kind of primary. Now I'm contradicting myself, I realize. I tried to say that this was a kind of primary pedagogical situation, and I was trying to give you an example of it, and I was taking the example of Jesus. Well, of course, that's a very bad example, because he did not do very much one-to-one teaching. I mean, he had his disciple, and they were about 11 or 12. I don't remember the exact number. So this is a bit different setup than in our conservatives, but let's assume it's basically the same ideas, okay? We still have instrumental or vocal classes in our conservatories. What happens in these groups? What happens in these relationships between a master and his or her disciples? What happens? And here I will introduce a third concept, which might, and now you understand why I emphasized that my background was in conservatory teaching, and not, I am not a teacher of children. Because my third concept is seduction. This one I picked up from a well-known writer, George Steiner, and his book, The Lessons of the Masters. It's a very thought-provoking book, published, I don't remember, perhaps 20 years ago or something. It was a reaction, his reaction to certain movements in the American university world. And it's very provoking, this book. It's very provocative. But there are some very interesting thoughts about it. He talks about the relationship between a master and his disciple. And he uses words like power and passion. And he also uses the word of trust. I mean, we could all see that these words kind of balance each other. But we must dare to speak about the passion as well. We are dealing with emotions, and we are dealing with our emotion not only between each other, because that's really secondary, but we are dealing about our emotions towards what we are doing, the music. This is very emotional, and we use our emotions to work with this. So the passion is there. And then, of course, the seduction is very close. And it can be seen as something quite dangerous. It can be seen as a corrupt relationship between a master and his or her disciples. But it can also be seen as something quite valuable. It can also be seen as a kind of voluntary and temporary submission to the knowledge and experience of somebody whom you value a lot. And here comes the concept of trust, of course. As a disciple, you are there because you want to be there, and you have chosen to be there. But when you made this choice, you are not in an equal position. But you have made the choice to be in that position. I think this is an area which we must dare to problematize and to talk about. I think it's quite interesting when we use the terminology of George Steiner. But we chose as a disciple to be in this situation. So we have still our own will. So I have a symmetry here between my concepts. I talked about democracy and the concept of voice. I talked about power and the concept of veto. And now, lastly, I talked about seduction, but counterbalanced by the concept of will. We put ourselves in this situation, so we still keep our voice. Well, this might have seemed a bit abstract, but sometimes I believe it's nice to use concepts and to talk about very important things in an abstract form. And with this, the importance of, I think, seduction, but in the same time of not losing our will and not losing our reason when we are seduced. With this, I end my little reflection. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your input. It was really interesting. And from abstract, now we go to more down to the topic, and we have the David Alladashvili, who has experienced both Georgian and then the Western education, and his input will be interesting after this presentations of views. Thanks again, Hans Helsten. David Alladashvili was invited into the Juilliard School in New York City in 2007, and he performed there, and he gave his debut in 2010. He has participated in many international competitions, given recitals, and appeared as a soloist with orchestras across Europe and America. Today, he is the PhD student at Tbilisi State Conservatory, while being a TV presenter and many Georgians' favorite TV personality. So, David, here you go.
Greetings. Very happy and honored to be part of this discussion, and very happy to listen to wonderful gentlemen give wonderful, very colorful presentation. And the good thing about being the last one is that I can actually say the least, because most of the ideas were already projected, but also were, as Iveri told me, kind of running out of time. And I can't really say much of anything new for a couple of reasons, but the main one being that on our minds right now, and you probably can relate to it, we have Ukraine, and that's the only thing we are thinking about. And you're right, Thomas, when mentioning that the title of this discussion was definitely created before we knew what was about to happen, but it's been going on since 2008. It's been going on since 1990, as Edgars pointed out for us and for the region. And somehow I think this is the time that we have to really finally merge and finally wake up and finally realize that the responsibility we take as musicians or as music educators or as teachers or as students are not solemnly for as a performer and for as a just a simple persona going on stage or going in front of TV or going in front of a camera, but also we are the citizens of the world. We're the citizens of the country we belong to. And I think this is the time when we really need to think about not just bringing more freedom into education and not just making sure that we are modernizing and moving forward somehow in our little tiny areas of expertise, but also in the sense that we are now really in power, as Hans said, and as Thomas said, and as Edgar said, we are in power of our passion, we're in power of our own voice, we're in power of our own talent, but this talent, this education, this experience is serving the whole world. This is serving the whole community. This is raising a whole new generation of people, of human beings who then later on hopefully will create a better world we can live in. And these are the sort of topics that I was surprised to hear when I first arrived to New York, when I first entered the Juilliard School. And the first book I got handed to was by our president of the Juilliard School back then, Joseph Polisi. It's Artist as a Citizen, a wonderful book. I suggest strongly. I realized that I was not just a young teenager pursuing my dreams to suddenly become a better pianist with a great background given to me in a Georgian music school. And you all know that the music school education in Georgia is with a large history, with a great history, with teachers that really came and went to teach and raise a wonderful generation of musicians. But there and then I realized that I was not just a musician. I was not just a wonderful soldier who is taking orders and giving orders back to the fingers. And to skip 10 years later, when I came back to Georgia, when Edgar's was speaking, I realized it's the same thing here. These youngsters now, they really realize that they get the voice. They really realize that they can make the difference. And I think this is the time as the future teachers or the teachers or even the students have to really give them and give ourselves the chance to express ourselves completely without any rules, without any borders to be brought to them, because that's what brought us to where we are right now in the world. And I understand that rules are there to guide us better, and in order to break the rules, first we have to know them, and we do have that in Tbilisi Conservatoire, and we do have that in every conservatoire. But I think this is the time we need to start thinking outside the box, thinking outside the small, tiny little rooms that we occupy on one-on-one lectures, which can and will definitely give our next generations wonderful experience. But this is the time to think globally. I'm saying all these general topics, but I guess that's the only thing we have right now against the enemy, north to us and east to you. But hopefully the next time we meet will be in an independent, united Georgia, with Abkhazia and Ossetia being again part of Georgia, in a maybe Tbilisi Conservatoire grand concert hall where we can all perform for each other and share the achievements that we did in the few months ahead of our actual physical meeting, rather than talk about the horrific event or the wishful thinking freedom in the musical education. I'll stop here because I think this is exactly the time we are given by Iveri and the Conservatoire, but maybe we can have a couple words to share as a dialogue. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, David, so much for your input. And I'm not a professional journalist or TV presenter, so I can be excused that I can be a bit extended the timing. Anyway, it was really, really interesting. I just want to give all of you maybe just 1 minute to conclude the session. And we can start with the same order, and maybe you could just reflect on today's situation. Are we really going back? Did the process of democratization really worked, or are we in the era of new Berlin Wall? And at the same time, what do you think? Of course, it is a broad question, and that cannot be answered in just 1 minute. But what do you think? Are we entering the period that we're still multi-layered development, and this eastern part of the Europe and eastern part of the world is not answering the questions that we ask in the western part, and with the social responsibility and the artistic citizenship of the musicians? Are we there that the gap even? Yeah, in the West we're going forward and that we're becoming more inclusive and more diverse, but does this make the gap even wider? Because do you think that the Eastern musical institutions are not keeping up as it should be because of the democratization and translation problems? We can start with Eდგars, and then we can go with the same order as the presentations.
Thank you, Viveri. Well, I was very glad to hear from today's presenters the ideas about giving voice and opportunity to marginalized communities, and also reminding us of the veto power of the student. In the democratic world, it really is an option. In the Soviet sphere, it certainly was not as big of an option. So yeah, I'm glad that we are moving in that direction. And also about the similarities between the former Soviet countries. Yeah, I certainly share the sentiment of both being able to observe the young generation as the heralds of new era, and those who are able to represent the 21st century in its, well, let's say entirety, not being the somewhat residual effects of the Soviet Union as myself. But what I am concerned about, and specifically from the standpoint of censorship, is that from institutionalized censorship, we have shifted towards the informal social censorship, and specifically self-censorship within the artistic community, and it is worldwide, and it is economically motivated and sometimes socially validated, or motivated by social validation or lack thereof. And somehow I fear that this, in combination with various populist movements around the world who are trying to take over the governments both in the East and the West, might present us with a certain challenge. However, I hope those challenges will be somewhat new, although I keep in mind that there is nothing new in this world, only things we have forgotten, and then we come to realization, oh, they have returned with a new iteration. So that's all from me.
Thank you. Intriguing. Thomas, what do you think? Maybe with the microphone. We can come back to you, and we can hear first from Hans, and then we can come back to Thomas.
I must also forget to unmute. I think there is no way back, as a matter of fact, once you have discovered that you have a voice. And I think that is valid also on a collective level. I don't think there is a way back. Of course, there will be temporary returns. I doubt, and it will be a hard time, and there will be fights. But I think that, well, I believe strongly myself that we will learn better and better as a humanity to think together, as a matter of fact. And I think music might serve as a model there. Music is a very, very good model for thinking together, working together, and configuring your own personal will against the collective will. I think music provides us with very good models.
Thank you.
Now I even worked out.
Post.
Now I even worked out
Right.
how to work my computer.
Mm.
I think Hans is absolutely right, and I think that is a very important point. That music is a very good medium for working together. It's a very good basis for actually collaborating and for sharing thoughts and artistic ideas and so on. To your questions about whether we're widening the gap, I must say that yes, temporarily maybe. I mean, but as Hans also said, I do think, and as I said in my own presentation, I do actually think that liberal democracies and the pluralism and the everything that goes with that will actually prevail. There is no way back. And also, I want to say that I've been working quite a lot on many international and global projects, and I've been working with universities and conservatoires in Africa and in Asia and in all but South America, all sorts of places. And I've found so many very, very progressive ideas in places where you would not think that they would come from. So I think it's not about East and West. It's about, or North and South for that matter. It's about making these communities and these societies where you can actually work together, with and in music, and being able to share ideas and share artistic experiences and so on. And I think that the way that we influence each other is maybe actually the most important thing. So working together is the way forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. Would you wrap up?
Absolutely. I won't be able to say anything original, but to go back to again what Edgar said, there's only my way or the wrong way of playing. If you think of that attitude from a teacher, then that teacher is not ready to receive our voice. The teacher is not ready to hear our voice, and possibly perhaps that teacher is not very talented and should not be teaching at all. But if you are serving music, and if you are serving art, and if you are an artist, as a true artist, not just as a performer, but as maybe that person who has never even heard music can suddenly become a musician, then there is no way we cannot coexist. And yes, maybe the gap is suddenly growing larger just because Mr. Putin decided to throw a little bomb there, but definitely we already saw, and especially with the use of modern technology, again, the first thing that brought everyone together was the Ukrainian anthem, and it was music that again won over the ugly monster that is trying to somehow ruin everything that was ever created by the artists. And it's always going to stay that way. And I think people are underestimating how much power we as musicians have, but we'll gain that power again and spread the love and reunite all the good people around the world. And I'm sure that we will definitely win at the end.
Thank you for that input, everybody. Today I was playing the concert at Palladium in Malmö, and I was playing the Russian music, Stravinsky's Firebird, and then I said that, and it was premiered in 1909 in Paris, and at the presenting I said that first they started poisoning us by the astonishing music, and now they went to the chemical weapons, and we don't know where it's going. But thank you, everyone. And for the audience, I want to say that this project is about also the inclusion. So with the next session that we have on 21st of March, there will be all women panel. So we are not discriminated against. And thanks again to Thomas Winter, Edgar Raginskis, Hans Helston, and David Alladashvili. And we'll see you next Monday, March 21st at 4 CET.
Thank you, Iveri.
Bye. Thank you.